I guess I missed the memo. Apparently, anime nowadays is not only supposed to be realistic, but realism also automatically determines whether the story is good. If you're part of any anime community, you've probably noticed a common trend flourishing, which entails responding to criticism about certain anime with arguments along the lines of, but this writing choice is realistic, therefore it is good. Or people going as far as discarding anime for not being realistic enough. While we could sit here and have multiple discussions about the topic of realism in anime, perhaps entertain the notion of whether or not a 2D and sometimes 3D medium must comply with the reality we live in, delve into how certain genres are supposedly more realistic, such as how realism may be more applicable to, say, a shoujo anime rather than a shonen anime, as I've seen debates surrounding the topic. It wouldn't change the fact that none of these arguments hold the bastion of accuracy. We should probably focus on the foundation of the argument. What seems to be escaping the audience's perception nowadays is that fiction in general has always been realistic. Let's get something out of the way before we even start. Every fictional story has grounds in reality. It may comment on reality, it may emulate reality. Regardless of direction and choice, authors still drive the foundation of their stories from reality, even at times subconsciously. Therefore, realism in fiction is not only necessary, but also inevitable. It is a vehicle for the audience to instantly develop a connection with the characters or the world or both. The fact stories rely on realism isn't indicative of how good a fictional story is, given that it is an inherent trait. That is, realism by itself cannot dictate how good a fictional story is. That'd be the equivalent of asserting every fictional story is good. In fact, realism, like many other literary devices and methodology, is prone to be either employed effectively or ineffectively. The question people should be aiming to pose whenever discussing realism in fiction is whether or not the author has created a fictional logic that feels realistic as you read the story, what it is plausible within the narrative. There is a famous quote by American writer Mark Twain in his book, Following the Equator, A Journey Around the World, that successively illustrates why realism in fiction shouldn't be measured or analyzed solely through factual logic we utilize in the real world. Truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't. What does Twain mean by this? Everything in fiction must have a meaning, even when the meaning is nothing. The nothingness must be depicted in a meaningful way. This differs considerably from human experience. Sometimes, bizarre things happen in real life that have little to no meaning. A crater suddenly opens and swallows a car. A tree gets hit by powerful lightning during a strangely convenient timing. An extremely weird chunk of ice falls from the sky. There is no deeper reasoning or pattern to the bizarre and the nothing in real life. It simply is, and we must accept it as such. However, fictional stories quite clearly don't follow the rules of the real world, otherwise it wouldn't be fiction. Even the unforeseen bizarreness, the absurd, the empty nothing carries some form of meaning, whether immense or not. For meaning to occur, fictional stories are built on a fictional logic provided by the author. Fictional logic acts as the skeleton of the story. It dictates the reality we must accept as the truth should we choose to continue reading or watching. That is why the absurd, the bizarre, must abide by the guidelines of the fictional world it belongs to. After all, the guidelines dictate why something or someone is absurd in the first place. The common trait I've noticed whenever someone argues for realism as an indicator of good storytelling is that they tend to lean towards factual logic being applied to a fictional story. This argument is bound to fail, since it boils down to whether the truth presented by the author coincides with the absolute truth we grapple with in real life. At first, I believed what they were trying to rationalize when they utilized this argument is how an author employs verisimilitude in accordance with storytelling instead of actual realism. While many aren't at all concerned about that and still refer to factual logic, those that seem to be are still missing the point. Because the issue lies with how people tend to measure how much verisimilitude the author has employed to the story in order for it to feel real, often claiming that the more verisimilitude, the better. That's always a slippery slope when it comes to fictional stories, since writers must prioritize following storytelling guidelines for their stories to sound succinct instead of preoccupying with how it will fit real world patterns and limitations. While a writer may throw the guidelines in the air and take a stab at occurrences happening by coincidence, it is crucial that the characters or the world or both are not only properly affected by it, but that there is proper reaction, behavior, and consequences to the occurrences. If a writer is not cautious with their handling of their fictional logic, the aspects of the story that have established meaning will begin to fall apart, and the audience will question the validity of the suspension of disbelief. For those that don't know, suspension of disbelief is when readers temporarily allow themselves to believe in something that isn't true to be able to enjoy a fictional story. Once the story breaks the suspension of disbelief, it will beg the question. So, this must be realistic, but that mustn't? Essentially, what was the point of introducing fictional logic only to undermine it by using realistic or factual logic? With that in mind, in terms of animation, the argument for factual logic to take precedence over fictional logic falls apart even further when animation is the perfect medium to deviate from harsh factual truths. The same can be said for the liberty manga and comics in general have as well. Think of how much of the criticism aimed at live action series and movies entails how constricted it is when it comes to special effects, given that animation has little to no boundaries when it comes to portraying the fantastical. And think of even how the portrayal of emotion through characters, and particularly the environment, can shine brighter in animation compared to live action. Speaking of animation, don't worry, I haven't forgotten that this video is about anime. How about we use one as an example of ineffective fictional logic? Think of My Hero Academia. Allow me to briefly set the stage in case you haven't watched this particular anime. This section will be heavily summarized, but admittedly still a bit lengthy, and I apologize in advance for that. But in order to understand the fictional logic and its flaws, it is important to understand the characters and the world they are part of. It'll be easier to see where the criticism is coming from. For the people that do watch My Hero Academia, this will have spoilers for the last season of the anime and some parts of the last chapters of the manga as well. I haven't watched the anime in a long time, but I think I stuck primarily to what's been covered in season 7. I'll still provide a spoiler warning for when the aspects of season 7 will come along in case you want to skip that. Let's get into it. MHA consists of a world of superpowered heroes and villains, living in a society that places great emphasis on having either a resourceful or powerful quirk. The heroes sign with respective agencies, some more prosperous than others, and their merits are measured based on hero rankings. With rankings at the core of the hero culture, the hero's ethos doesn't necessarily highlight altruistic actions, but rather entertainment. The heroes function as celebrities. Being a good person outside of the uniform doesn't necessarily matter as long as the public is convinced of their role in saving others, and as long as they're entertained and enamored by their alter ego. It is also revealed that the structure of their society surrounding quirks and heroes have resulted in corruption, with major propaganda, censorship, even torture, and extrajudicial killings. oppressed and or abused masses being put in a path of villainy. While there are characters who boil down to being villains for the sake of being villains, so to speak, there are also a huge number of villains who were failed either by society or their families or both and had no prospect other than becoming villains. This isn't to say all heroes are awful. After all, the number one hero, All Might, truly cares and does save many people, as do other heroes shown in the story. But more so that there's no pressure in truly caring about saving others. Needless to say, MHA's author Horikoshi Kohei has laid the grounds for a complex and compelling world, one where the society and its government possesses layers of moral grayness. This is often brought up by fans as an aspect of the story that is realistic, and you guessed it, it is often where the ineffectiveness of the fictional logic lies. The moral grayness isn't what is ineffective. In fact, it is warmly welcomed in a story like My Hero Academia, but rather how main characters and side characters react and act to it, ultimately in dissonance with the narrative. A common agreement in discussions regarding realism, or rather believability, in fiction is that it isn't so much about world building, but rather how characters will react to the world they are part of. Much of the story's fictional logic is dependent on how consistent the characters are within the story. If an author continuously disregards the guidelines pertaining to character development and personality, or in case of plot, holding one aspect in a much higher regard in one moment only to completely discard it in the next, the audience will no longer trust the author. And this continuous disregard will eventually lead to the story becoming a shell of what it used to be. It starts to betray itself because it starts to lose its meaning. Endeavor and subsequently the Todoroki family are great examples of this. Get out of this comment section with your vitriolic insults until you hear me until the end. I'm serious. Get your fingers away from the keyboard. Get away from this video if you can't handle criticisms when it comes to these fictional characters. If you don't watch My Hero Academia, Endeavor is a very controversial character in the subject of multiple vitriolic discussions online, and I just don't have the patience for it anymore. Endeavor, or Todoroki Enji, and the Todoroki family fall both within the effective and ineffective categories. However, even the effectiveness has been tainted by the ineffectiveness. Despite Endeavor's boorish attitude, he saves many people and caters to a certain audience enough to guarantee a spot as the number 2 hero. Outside of the uniform, though, Todoroki Unji is far from a good man. After failing to achieve his dream-turned obsession of surpassing the number 1 hero, All Might, Unji essentially bought his wife, Himurarei, due to her powerful ice quirk, in order to have children strong enough to take over his obsession. The first son, Toya, initially held Enji's hopes, given his flames were more powerful than his father's. However, his body couldn't withstand the heat. Enji goes as far as coercing his wife to have more children after deeming his first two, Toya and Fuyumi, as failures. The youngest of 4, Shoto, proved to have the perfect quirk in Enji's eyes. Enji then proceeded to make Shoto go through grueling training at the age of 5, with the boy often receiving beatings. Shoto was also alienated from his siblings to the point he barely knew them, on top of witnessing his mother's physical and psychological abuse up close. Enji's first son, Toya, struggled with the neglect from his father, experiencing the fall from being the golden child to the scapegoat of the family, neither being good positions. Toya is shown to have knowledge of how their family came to be from a young age, adapting to a twisted notion of love, imparting from his father's approval and disapproval. As Toya took on his father's obsession as a means to not only be loved, but also to give his existence meaning, he ended up self harming incessantly by training with his quirk. He often spiraled mentally. Eventually, Toya dies by his own flames due to his inability to control his quirk when going through emotional turmoil. Rei also spiraled mentally, eventually leading to her attacking Shoto for resembling his father too much. Her attack resulted in her being put away in a mental institution for over a decade. So far, fictional logic is incredibly effective. These characters consist of consequences of the world they are part of. As the story progressed to the point where heroes were at war with villains, Toya revealed himself to be alive and to be Dabi, a major villain in the story. During his reveal, Toya broadcasted the truth about Endeavor to the general public. The public, and especially the hero scorn at Dabi's reveal, wasn't employed correctly, given that it lacks connection to what has been previously established as righteousness and justice by the protagonists. The reveal, as iconic as it was, also unfortunately happened on terrible timing on Horikoshi's part. In such a pivotal and impacting moment in the story, the audience doesn't get to witness true public scorn, one that carries heavily throughout. Worst of all, the heroes have little to nothing to say about Endeavor's actions. This could have balanced the public's lackluster and clearly biased portrayal of scorn had the heroes acted as appropriate social consequences. One of the top heroes, Genist, blames Dabi for coming forward with the truth about his father, deeming the crimes as bad laundry, and focusing more so on the fate the public had on heroes breaking, rather than direct such blame to Endeavor for committing the crimes against his family in the first place. In fact, the protagonist of the story goes as far as responding to Dabi's reveal with the following.
轟くんは大事な友達だ。エンデバーは僕を強くしてくれた恩師だ。過去は消えない。だから頑張ってる今のエンデバーを僕は見てる。お前はエンデバーじゃない。
Kurapika is now drowning in an indescribable emptiness.
I can't make this up. I can't even make this shit up, bro. How did it get to this point? In a story of heroes and villains, such as Emeche, all of the aforementioned feels like a whiplash to a viewer or reader who understands what is happening. Horikoshi places major importance in societal realism in one breath, only to remove it completely in the next. Before any fan tries to discredit the criticism, allow me to highlight what Horikoshi did effectively in terms of the fictional logic he created. The duality of the hero culture being embodied in one character, that is, Endeavor. While outward he was saving people, inside of his house he was terrorizing and abusing his family. Horikoshi also successively employed Endeavor's egocentric nature when he comes to realize he is at fault for the downfall of his first son and for the hurt he has caused to the family in general. He only came to see that after achieving his dream of being the number one hero, while maintaining an attitude that was primarily focused on himself. His line of thought is primarily his guilt, his suffering, what drove him to act in abusive ways. When he revisits his role as an abuser, it is often through a lens of, but I did it for your own good. In a way, he feels like a narcissistic mother, incapable of admitting fault without resorting to excuses. These are traits that are congruent with his character and congruent with the world he is part of. A character that has realized too little too late that despite his hard work and despite his achievements, his downfall as a father became his failing as a hero. A world possessing a society that placed great emphasis on hero rankings, on power being synonymous with success, and precisely that emphasis bringing about their downfall. But this is how the ineffectiveness is then intertwined with the effectiveness of the story, because this is where things starts to fall apart. The aspect of failure, the aspect of Endeavor having to choose between being a hero and a father was never supposed to be separate completely, because as we see, the consequences of his actions as a father come back to haunt him when he is trying to focus on being a hero. Or at least it was supposed to be the downfall of the heroic aspect of this character. But we don't see that from a society that, by the fictional logic, was already losing their faith in heroes, and therefore should have had a harsher reaction to the truth behind Endeavor, the abuser that Todoroki Unji had been for over 20 years. Because that harsher reaction would be symbolic for the faith that they have in heroes in general, and faith that they have beyond that, faith that they have in a hero culture. They were supposed to, at that moment, realize that the hero culture that they so love in their society has pushed forward all of these issues that they are grappling with in the middle of a literal war. Society itself is not even like the major issue with this. It certainly helps in terms of world building how the ineffectiveness of the fictional logic starts to interfere with the story. But what absolutely shatters the fictional logic is then the main characters and the ones that we spend more time with, which are the heroes. Heroes that, by the fictional logic, are then faced with a dilemma in the middle of a war. This is the moment for you to question who you are as a hero. They are then faced with the dilemma of abandoning the persona, of abandoning the worship that they hold so close to the hero culture in general and to other heroes, to then adorn the suit in a way that actually prioritizes true altruism instead of a performance. A performance that is both to their colleagues and to their society and to themselves. But in such a cathartic moment, such as the aforementioned, what the audience gets instead is factual logic being applied to the story. The overtly critical society we've been shown throughout the entirety of the story suddenly doesn't have it in them to show proper scorn. And in one panel where there is substantial scorn directed at Endeavor, I'm not sure about the anime, but I do know that in the manga, the character is then portrayed as slobby, lazy, dirty. Society and heroes can't bring themselves to care, either because of their worship or because the heroes need to win a war. As some fans will often just push down people that are questioning why none of these important aspects of the fictional logic presented by Horikoshi himself are suddenly unimportant, by saying, well, the heroes, realistically, they need to win a war, so they can't worry about that. Realistically, I don't care. Horikoshi had been building up that moment from the second that we are introduced to Endeavor and Shoto, and then building up even more when we're introduced to the rest of the league. Because that's the thing, like, that war, the extent that it's happening, the way that it happened, it didn't have to happen. Things are not happening upon a page. To a writer, they write that. That's what I mean about terrible timing. Why would you leave one of the most important scenes and most important points that you are trying to provide to your audience, that he has been trying to provide to the audience since the beginning of the story? Why would you undermine everything for the factual logic that they need to worry about the war? If the war is to be symbolic because this is a fictional story, this is the moment. This is it. This is the moment for hero culture to start crumbling, truly crumbling. Majority of MHA fans will often resort to arguments such as the aforementioned of this is a war, so realistically no one can care about what's happening. If not that, then they will resort to the argument of, well, it is good. This is good writing because in the real world, celebrities get away with atrocities. Let me play your game. Let me play where your head is at, okay? Let me be realistic here for a kick, okay? Hey, it's okay that you abuse your family. As long as you're a good cop or a good soldier, you can have a rude attitude. You can destroy public property when doing your job or whatever. You can just be an overall bummer. But as long as you do what you have to do as a cop, as long as you do what you have to do as a soldier, who cares about the pain your family is going through? In fact, if your family ever comes forward about your actions, they're nothing more than an inconvenience to society. It's uncomfortable for society to have to confront what is happening. And if you want to talk about it, you have to act exactly like I want you to act. You have a very limited window here as to how you can react to your abuse. And once you escape that window, then yeah, you should die. Is this a message you want your audience to retain? And you know what? It would have been great if My Hero Academia has established since the beginning that the tone is dark, that this is a tragedy. Because then arriving at this point in the story, the second half to the end, where this is the message, it would have been welcome. Because it would have been dark. It would have meant to be dark. It would have meant to be a tragedy. But it isn't portrayed that way, and that's the problem. What the fans fail to realize is that Horikoshi had been building with his fictional logic and narrative. The moment both heroes and society would abandon their inflammatory status quo in favor of adhering and admiring true heroics, because the system, as it stands, isn't good. In order for both society and heroes to even do that, they must first accept and abhor the reality. They have created the monsters that plague them. Instead, we get a failure of a father throwing himself a pity party, with other heroes rallying him up, whilst society just completely disregards what drove villains to become villains in the first place, unable to comprehend their role in the oppressive system they are part of. According to the fictional logic that's been established since the beginning of the story and up until the first half of the manga, the new generation of heroes, which happen to have the protagonist, Izuku, along with deuteragonists such as Shoto and Katsuki, are shown to be the differential aspects of heroes, especially Izuku. However, the protagonist never actually confronts the issues in society. He goes as far as recognizing the moral grayness, and yet he doesn't let go of the hero worship, or he doesn't even experience a little bit of disillusionment with hero society. According to his initial characterization, this inability to question the unfairness of the world he is part of is somehow very out of character. This is the indication of the story beginning to betray itself by applying factual logic to it, to the point that the protagonist is not even his own character anymore, but rather a mouthpiece of factual logic within the fictional story. One moment the story begs its protagonist and the viewer to see certain issues and proceeds to urge the viewer to ignore said issues in another. It creates major disharmony. Moving on. Death can be a tricky subject in fiction. Ask literally anybody, whether they watch anime or not. If they can recall a fictional character's death done terribly wrong, chances are they'll know a character by heart. Up until the overarching climax of the story, Horikoshi had somewhat successively tackled character deaths. Before arriving at the final culminative fight, countless casualties have occurred on both sides. Albeit, when it comes to heroes, it happens more so to side characters, and especially to what some call red shirts, so no fully developed character. Casualties that range from complete brutality, such as a character dying after its torso blows up, a Nanami Kento esque death, to fairly simple murder, such as a character gets stabbed in the back, something seemingly inconsequential considering a world filled with over the top quirks. This part will entail spoilers for the final chapters, particularly chapter 429 and a couple of chapters before and after. So if you want to skip, I will leave the timestamp here and feel free to just ignore this part. Amidst the climax of the war, a character dies after a blood transfusion, Toga, but others don't when they become nothing more than a hairpin, headshot, or have an open chest surgery occurring mid battle, Katsuki. Members of the audience may not feel inclined to question the validity of Toga's death within the world she is part of if the heroes were offered the same treatment for injuries that are admittedly more brutal. The issue is not so much her death being by such a simple reason, but more so related to the fictional logic provided by Horikoshi since the beginning of the manga, and proven by the aforementioned casualties, being thrown to the air during what is supposed to be the climax of an all out war, the final battle between heroes and villains. How is the audience expected to believe that if the heroes were to lose, it would be the end of civilization as they know it, given that not one main hero, not a single one, dies by the hands of villains? The heroes are, realistically and even fictionally, a force to be reckoned with, beckoned by multiple organizations, the government, even other countries, and surprisingly, a great majority of society. Given that Horikoshi continuously expects his audience to abide by realistic logic, how is the audience then expected to believe in a fictional reality proposed earlier by the story that the stakes are truly high for the heroes? Before the group of wolves jump at this criticism and attempt to assign personal bias to it, because if you have a sharp eye, I know you caught my toga figure poking in the back. And you're probably thinking, well, you like the villains, so obviously you are gonna be upset about the fact that they all died or were arrested. The problem isn't that the heroes win. In fact, I welcomed the heroes winning if Horikoshi had followed through with his fictional logic and narrative. But let me explain. In terms of character deaths and overall combat, what matters is the execution and outcome of the battle within the fictional logic the story follows, and subsequently, the character deaths having a semblance of meaning. In terms of world building and its subsequent political and societal connotations, what matters is the consequences occurring according to what has been previously established in the narrative. When it comes to death and combat, connected, okay? So, in the instance of Izuku and Shigaraki, combat wise, when it comes to One for All, the whole thing that Izuku argues throughout the anime is that One for All is a power to save, not to kill. Even when presented by Gran Torino with, sometimes killing people is saving them, which is so fucked up on so many levels for an anime for younger audience to even harp on that. He then completely ignores that and kills Shigaraki with one punch. He saw, Shigaraki's past. He saw how he was groomed. He saw how he was denied help and compassion by society. He saw that Shigaraki himself was starting to realize that, well, shit, everything about my life has been constructed to put me in this position. And he still kills him because Shigaraki doesn't want to follow the status quo perpetrated by the hero culture. Okay, he's still doesn't believe that society is going to change, which, based on everything that I've said before, and this goes back to world building, societal and political connotations, nothing was looking to change there. And he saw that. So, of course, he's going to deny. Much like Twice, when Hawks presents him with the option of, I can help you if you follow everything that I tell you to, which is precisely following a culture that has led you to be dehumanized, to be turned away, to be an outcast. But if you follow that, then I'll save you. Twice's response was also no, because the people that did show that they give a fuck about him were the other outcasts. So this is paralleled here with Shigaraki, but it's bad. It's bad because Twice's murder was supposed to be poignant because a hero killed a villain, and that was unheard of. Izuku constantly saying, it's a power to save. Being a hero is to save others. How are you going to portray one murder as abhorrent? You can say whatever you want. Oh, Hawks didn't have another option or whatever. Yeah, the fastest man in the world didn't have another option to subdue Twice. Okay. Even in the manga, Hawks is portrayed as scary, you know? In this moment, he is the villain here. He is concerning. But then we are shown with Izuku and Shigaraki and him punching Shigaraki after seeing the truth about his life anyway and killing him as something inspirational, as something that constitutes as I reached out and I helped you. So once again, narrative dissonance rooted in a fucked up fictional logic. Like, there is no fictional logic up until this point that is congruent with what has been established, right? Because by the end, we are then calling out for realistic logic, which so many members of the audience have of, well, you did something, then you have to die for it. See how it's just this harmony all throughout. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth if you understand what's going on. Strictly when it comes to world building and societal and political connotations, their deaths had no meaning. The fact that Spinner, which is part of the League of Villains, wrote a book about Shigaraki, it didn't really matter because the only people actually adhering to the story of Shigaraki and what drove everybody in the League of Villains to become villains in the first place. Because it's going to the people that understand how they were put in that position. So, in other words, people that used to be villains. But the public at large doesn't give a fuck. There's still a ranking that upholds a privilege position, makes you better than everybody else, essentially. Hawks becomes the president of the government organization that essentially manipulated him and abused him into becoming like Lady Nagant, which I showed earlier, who was going around committing extrajudicial killings and, knew of the torture happening behind the scenes, knew of the corruption, knew of the propaganda. He becomes the president of that organization after not suffering any repercussions for murdering Twice. So he essentially learns nothing that he can actually apply now. Uraraka social program inspired by Toga? I guess, I guess. Congratulations. At least it's something, given the stagnant position that society is in by the end, and even the heroes, I guess. I guess I'll take that. And I'll tell you why it doesn't matter, okay? A lot of people say, no, it does matter. It's gonna help kids like Toga. Here's the thing, it's not. Because it doesn't get to the core of the problem. The problem is also not addressed because nobody in the school knew of what was going on inside Toga's house. So it starts with the parents. If the parents views their children as deviant and that's something that we never address after, are you gonna solve The quirk discrimination or what? The dehumanization? If you're not addressing the root of the problem, how are you going to help anybody? It goes back to this is a broken system, an oppressive system in place. So reforms to an already fucked up system is not going to help anything because it's still going to follow the ladder of oppression, you feel me? Like the cherry on top by the end was Shigaraki's last words to Izuku, do your damn best to maybe change society. Change what drove people like me to get to this point.
No.
The words were to inspire Izuku to ask Uraraka out on a date. Very, very inspiring, very meaningful. I may sound harsh towards Horikoshi so far, and if I do, I'm not even gonna apologize at this point. I feel strongly because he had potential. Horikoshi began MHA with attention towards consistency. He was on a path of combining Kishimoto's skillful character focused writing with more sprinkles of attention towards world building and how it reacts and changes based on the characters. This dissonance in MHA could have been prevented and possibly ignored by the audience, convinced to perceive it as the absurdness of the MHA world, something we see with other anime such as Hunter x Hunter, One Piece, Tokyo Ghoul, Chainsaw Man, and so on, had Horikoshi not relied so much on realistic logic instead of fictional logic. Especially given that MHA is a shonen anime, which is expected to prioritize the flashy, the absurd, the bizarre, and use those elements to then convey meaning through fights, power, conflicts, relationships, etc. Why undermine such unapologetic fiction with realism? But, as I said before, Horikoshi is not the only one at fault for a poor handling of death in fiction. One of my favorite anime, One Piece, and its mangaka Eiichiro Oda also handled death poorly. Oda is very famous for his fake out deaths, which ultimately results in meaningless sacrifices. It places a strain in the story as a whole, given that Oda demonstrates he is capable of writing compelling and meaningful deaths. One of the examples of this mishandling is Pell from the Arabasta arc, carrying a bomb to the skies and exploding with it in order to save the thousand civilians, as well as the princess of the family he guarded. His character's sacrifice initially held substantial meaning to the deuteragonist of the arc, Princess Vivi. The emotional sacrifice was then absolutely scrapped for no reason other than maintaining that character alive for the sake of supposed relief. It was so unnecessary, especially considering Pell isn't even that important outside of Arabasta arc. The death also presents issues in terms of what I mentioned earlier in the video, of why certain occurrences can be realistic while others aren't. So a bomb of such caliber can't kill Pell, but the same can't be said for a similar death, such as Pedro. This is the only ineffective use of fictional logic I can think of when it comes to One Piece, though. Many fans may point towards the power system, but One Piece never placed major importance in its power system, such as, say, Hunter x Hunter and Jujutsu Kaisen. It has always been goofy, outwardly, and limitless in its approach. What I spoke previously about my grievances with the end of MHA not being rooted in the fact that the heroes win, I feel like it's proven by how much I love One Piece. Because One Piece is the definition of the main crew always winning despite the odds, to the point that the crew will win by the end. But regardless of the repetition, their victory always feels satisfying. And that is due to the build-up Oda constructs, the continuous storylines abiding by the fictional logic he created. Much of the discussion surrounding One Piece is how the anime successively portrays its world compared to ours. In fact, much of the historic influence that One Piece has will feel familiar to readers that are well versed in them. However, One Piece isn't good because it manages to interweave its fictional world with our reality. It is good because it never strays from the themes and meaning the author is attempting to convey. The story rarely betrays itself. It is not perfect by any means, but compared to many, it is consistent. Multiple times throughout My Hero Academia, Horikoshi's writing mistakes, whether they were born from himself and the pressure or his editors in Shonen Jump, are defended by fans through the excuse that it is realistic. However, moments that break the harmony of the story aren't good because they're realistic. They are flawed in terms Horikoshi himself created. That is, Horikoshi's failure entails his inconsistency in adhering to his own fictional logic, and that inconsistency being born from constantly appealing towards factual logic. Overabundance of actual realism in anime is a recipe for disaster. Anime isn't about realism. Shoujo protagonists have plot armor too, babes. After all, shoujo encompasses more than romance. And hey, it's okay that they have plot armor. Even the slice of life anime with a setting in high school that you got going on in your head right now, even that isn't supposed to be realism. It borders more so on escapism, if anything. It's always a bit funny to me when MHA fans try to like excuse the decline in character development or like a complete shift in character personality when confronted with these. They will always counter with, especially when it comes to Class 1A, they will counter with, well, they are children. How do you expect them to react if they are children? Of course, they wouldn't know what to do. Are you new here? Have you watched anime before? Have you watched Yu Gi Oh? Have you watched Cardcaptor Sakura? Have you watched Naruto? Have you watched, like, anime in general? Are you new here? Being a child doesn't save you in anime. If that was the case, Card Captor Sakura would feature 7-year-olds being 7-year-olds, no dangerous magical fights that can result in death for small children such as Sakura in Shoran. Hunter x Hunter's Gon and Killua? Get someone to call the CPS. And it's kind of crazy to me too because like even if you're trying to be realistic, okay, they're like 14 to 16 years old. There's still some critical thinking happening when you are those ages. You know, you're not a newborn baby that you don't know what the fuck is going on. Some readers or watchers may say that whether the author chooses to follow or not follow the verisimilitude guidelines they've created, the merit of their writing is a matter of taste. Therefore, one cannot accurately judge the verisimilitude the author is providing. In other words, some readers or watchers may say that realism in fictional stories is a subjective matter. I find it important to highlight that while taste is subjective, there are still guidelines as to what constitutes good writing. I may not enjoy a story, but I can recognize when an author has good writing. For example, I didn't particularly enjoy Naruto. I like it, but it's just not for me. But I can still recognize Kishimoto's skillful character focused writing and how it was ahead of its time, and it still is influential to new gen mangakas, such as Horikoshi with My Hero Academia, and some aspects of Gege Akutami's Jujutsu Kaisen. Remember, the point of a fictional story isn't to follow actual realism, but to follow the narrative it constructed. Having a glimpse into both the Western, particularly US American, and the global South sides of the internet is an enlightening experience when it comes to how culture translates in social media settings. It certainly helps that I've been able to experience the glimpses in real life too. What I mean is fandom discussions, whether canonical or not, with my Brazilian peers very exponentially compared to discussions with my US American peers. Brazilian peers tend to primarily analyze media for the media. US American, on the other hand, tend to primarily analyze through their cultural lens. This isn't the ultimate assessment, completely black and white. Of course, both countries overlap between interpreting solely media versus interpreting solely through a cultural lens. The nuance isn't lost in this. However, it is undeniably noticeable how the cultural lens tends to take precedence in Western spaces. This isn't me bashing the United States and the West in general, for that matter, educational system, but is just a point that I feel it is imperative to keep in mind moving forward. In terms of realism being overwhelmingly favored in Western countries, particularly the United States, this following Reddit comment from a discussion regarding realism in fiction explained it better than I could. I'll be leaving the link to the discussion in the description of this video since it is filled with compelling responses. It's culturally specific, but in countries like the US, a large part of how genres and media get legitimated is by appealing to so called realism. There's a long history, which is tied into things like Enlightenment and Puritan values, of texts being legitimated both culturally and critically when they can claim to be affiliated with frameworks of rationality and contemporary understandings of scientific principles. There's also been a historic distrust of the act of fantasizing itself, which is perceived as indulgent and unproductive. So, the more a fantasy text can claim to be realistic or exploring real world issues, the most respected it tends to be. It's allowed to be fantasizing, but only if it's fantasizing in culturally approved ways. I can already hear the crowd screaming,
What does anime has to do with Western countries? It is a Japanese form of entertainment.
or how futile it is to approach anything Eastern with an emphasis on the West. While I believe the latter is undoubtedly valid and truthful in terms of applying Western lens when analyzing media that quite clearly utilizes ideals and cultural influences rooted in the East, the reality of the internet at large is quite different. And look, I agree. The crowd is right, okay? Anime is not Western. Anime was not made with primarily a Western audience in mind. The internet, on the other hand, is unfortunately largely dictated by Western standards. Hey, this video having to be in English in order to reach a broader audience is proof of that. Se eu tivesse falado português o tempo inteiro, você ia ter assistido esse vídeo até essa parte? I speak more in depth about this in my first video, The Shift in Fandom and Shipping, which I'll be leaving in the recommendations if you are interested. But for now, I'll leave you with this. People may interact online with their respective cultural lens, but it doesn't change the fact that they often must adapt to a westernized blueprint if they want to have a semblance of civil discussions or to be truly understood. Which means that the Western blueprint is utilized sometimes subconsciously, other times technically forcibly, when having discussions within the anime community online, or any other media community in an online globalized setting for that matter. It doesn't change the Eastern connection and connotation that anime has at all, but rather limits the discussions online to how palpable it can be to a Western audience. If you truly care about trying to analyze anime or manga through literary lens, then abandon the notion of realism. Enter the fictional world before you with the fact that realism is always present in fictional stories. Start to analyze the grounds in believability. Is the suspension of disbelief held throughout the story? If not, why is it constantly breaking? If the story focuses on world building, are the characters acting congruent with the world they are part of? If the story focuses on characters, is the world congruent with the consequences or lack thereof based on the characters? Those questions will lead to the fictional logic constructed by the mangaka. It bears repeating that if you want to analyze a realistic aspect of anime, then it's best to focus on whether the author has built a fictional logic that is effective or ineffective. If the story can hold itself up without having to constantly resort to factual logic. When you, as a reader or watcher, cannot explain the story without having to constantly resort to reality, given that the fictional logic proves itself to be lacking, then yes, that warrants criticism. If a story begins to fall apart, then the author has either failed to maintain the story's themes, its meaning, to maintain character development and personality, or maintain world building, or if it's a dumpster fire of a story, maintain all of the above. With all this video in mind, can we finally stop using the argument that absolutely unwarranted writing choices are good because they're realistic? There you have it, folks. Finally, I've been talking about this video for what? I think 4 months, 3 months now. I'm sorry. Let me already get like the cat out of the bag. I recorded portion of this video before my surgery, and this is me recording after my surgery. So I hope that like the shift in the makeup and like the setting and everything isn't too jarring. I had to wait more than I thought that I would have to wait to recover from my surgery. I'm not like fully recovered yet. Yeah, I just wanted to get this video out there as soon as I could, and I'm just glad that it's finally out. I hope I explained everything concisely. It's been a good while since I had inspiration to write an essay this size, so this was supposed to be a 15-minute video. But then I, started to do more research and saw more comments on Tumblr, on TikTok, and I realized that this is probably more nuanced than I explained, you know? If you have any other thoughts about it, any other insights about realism in fiction, please leave a comment. I'm particularly curious about how the old gen anime watchers versus the new gen anime watchers feel about this, since I feel like old gen don't really care about it much. I consider myself old gen, and I don't really. Growing up watching anime, I was never like, ooh, the realism. Like the appeal of anime for me was the unapologetic fiction of it. So I'm curious as to how people see that. If you are engaging in discussions regarding the anime that I've mentioned in the video, please be mindful with each other. Please be mindful with the things that you are saying in the comment section. I know that things can get heated sometimes when you want to defend something that you like, okay? If you are an MHA fan and by some miracle you're still watching by this part, if nothing that I said resonated with you and it makes you angry and it makes you impulsive and makes you want to bash me in the comments, leave. Leave, please. I've had enough of that on TikTok. I don't have patience for this anymore. I'm so serious. If you enjoy videos such as this, I have more video essays available in my YouTube channel, so feel free to check some out. I'm gonna leave them here. If you like My Hero Academia, I have the reaction and commentary to the first episodes available here on my YouTube channel. The rest is available on my Patreon for free. You don't have to pay to watch anything. And finally, if you enjoy gaming, I have a gaming channel. I'll be leaving the recommendation here. So far, there's only 2 videos there, but if that's up your alley, please check it out. If you subscribe to me, thank you so much for being here. If you don't, please consider doing so I know that the hard work is worth it. Thank you for watching, and I hope I see you next time. Ciao!